Let me begin with a quick minor correction from the very end of part one. I stated erroneously that it was the then IDF Chief Chaplain Shlomo Goren who in 1967 proclaimed, Har Habayit Biyadenu, Temple Mount is in our hands. Although Goren was the IDF Chief Chaplain at the time, and he may have even been present, he was not the one that made that monumental declaration. Rather, it was a paratrooper by the name of Mota Gur. So this is only a technical part 3, and you'll see why in a minute. In this part, I will be discussing the Israeli Yeshiva student IDF draft, or Chok HaGius, controversy that has always been front in Israeli politics, but since October 7, 2023, has become front and center. I must first disclaim that by making this podcast, I'm risking my reputation within the larger Haredi community. It also may appear to some that following my political bent, flaunted in parts 1 and 2, that I am an enigma and I'm conflicting. But no, it is not so. And once you've heard me out, you will understand and hopefully agree. I am further mindful that I may even suffer severe backlash from my own constituents. But that's okay, because as I cautioned in the beginning of part 1, here you will hear strictly the emes, the truth, and nothing less. Let's then begin at the beginning. At a provisional state council meeting in 1948, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, decided to exempt yeshiva students from requiring serving in Israel's armed forces. Thus, first, I'm not even sure where from Israel's Supreme Court maintains jurisdiction to overturn a provisional state council decision, but the backwardness of Israel's political landscape and its general legal and jurisprudential procedures and processes is for another podcast. Fact remains that on June 25, 2024, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that Israel's Chok Gius, or draft law, or at the very least under extenuating circumstances, Sherut Le'umi, volunteer service to their country, perhaps akin to our Peace Corps or National Guard, applies to all males 18 years of age without exception, and no longer do exemptions apply for yeshiva students. We must then first ask, what was the method to Ben-Gurion's madness to begin with? To understand this, we must go back even further in history and gain an appreciation for the founding of Zionism and formation of the State of Israel. And although I will not now offer a complete history of same, because that is beyond the scope of this podcast, and there are already many books and podcasts that have exhausted this topic ad nauseum, I will, for better or for worse, state the following fact. The Zionist idea and its brainchild, the State of Israel, was primarily, if not exclusively, created and established by the secular Jewish left, not the Orthodox or Haredi. It must be further noted that not only were the Orthodox not neutral vis-a-vis the establishment of a Jewish state, but most were also vociferously opposed. Most notable among them were Rabbi Joel of Satmar, Rabbi Shalom Dovber of Lubavitch, and to a lesser extent his son, Rabbi Joseph Schneerson. Again, I'm not here going to discuss the legitimacy nor veracity or virtue of each side of the political aisle. This is neither the place nor the time for that. I'm merely laying down the facts. That said, Ben-Gurion was wise and realized that regardless of the ultra-Orthodox position on both Zionism and its state, it was politically expedient to throw the Haredim a bone, if you will. After all, it's a small price to pay for appeasement. Why, after all, his side, the secular left, still runs and operates everything else in the country, most importantly its government, and he knew well that this would remain the case for the foreseeable future. Rather ironic that the ultra-Orthodox owe their freedom from service all these years to a secular leftist. That is the quick Cliff's Notes version of the evolution of draft exemption related to Israel's yeshiva students. As a general proviso, I must say that the reaction or response of these Haredim to either Knesset talk of repealing the Ben-Gurion encyclical and or the latest Supreme Court decision is pathetic, childish, and sophomoric, nearly as pathetic as the pro-Hamas pogromists. To disrupt an already broken country with such brazen means as obstructing and shutting down not Herzl Street or King George or Dizengoff, but rather highways 1, 4, and 6, Israel's 3 major thoroughfares, is simply disgusting and counterproductive. Furthermore, these protests also caused the government to reappropriate desperately needed resources from the external battleground to the internal one. A true shanda makes no logical sense and is nothing more than a child's temper tantrum. So now that we laid the groundwork for this entire malaise, let's discuss and rebut the three primary arguments the ultra-Orthodox raises for its position. 1. This one's a more abstract or theoretical argument, and it goes like this. Just like God's country requires a physical army, so too alongside it requires a metaphysical army of devout students studying his Torah and observing its commandments, and only thereby is Israel in position to overcome its multiple enemies. Rebuttal. First, King David didn't acknowledge this fact. Was King Saul not the greatest Torah scholar of his time? And how about Yoav or Avner, their respective ministers of defense? It is astonishing to me, though it shouldn't be, that these Haredim raise such foolish and unsound reasoning for their position when internally they know well that this is utter gobbledygook, nothing more. While you wind the clock back to the last time Jews were considered sovereign in their own land, and you will find that every male, with nearly no exception, and many of them giant Torah scholars, including those above-mentioned greats, joined and or led their respective armed forces. And while it is true that Torah lists 3 exemptions from service, nowadays these are virtually completely inapplicable. Second, while you yeshiva student enter service at age 18, there'll be plenty of Torah studied and prayers offered in the yeshivot and synagogues from those below 18 and those above 20. And I'd love to know how they defend the psalm, Et la'asot Lashem heferu Toratecha. For a greater, more urgent cause, one may disrupt or abandon, even violate Torah, both the study and practice. It is for these reasons that I call bogus on this so-called justification. It is gibberish and nonsensical, and the Haredi raises it with great fervor and vigor only to obfuscate and make himself the victim, just like the left do all the time, yell and cry racism with no basis nor justification, and the world shudders. Third, this argument of defense, and so many other similar ones the Haredim attempt to proffer, falls flat on its face when we're talking milchemet mitzvah, as opposed to reshut, which most, if not all, of Israel's wars are, where virtually, even according to halakha, no exception applies, everyone is required to participate. Second argument. The IDF does not accommodate its religious or observant soldiers with all their spiritual needs, including and most predominantly those relating to food of the highest kosher standards and modesty of the sexes. Rebuttal. First, why then do we find the mitnachlim, settlers, most of which are far more fastidious in their observance of Torah than these yeshiva boys, dare I say, and or say students from such prominent yeshivot as Markaz Harav, and even many within Chabad Hasidut, serving proudly without qualms or issue. They too require kosher food of the highest standards. They too require strict rules of modesty. How do they manage to endure? Unless, as I maintain, the general Haredi argument of justification is nothing more than another red herring. Second, even if this is not so, and I'm talking gibberish, I promise you, if the Haredi community en masse were to resolve to join the draft and enlist in the IDF as required at age 18 without objection, the Israeli government will have no choice but to accede to its very reasonable demands. And if it did not, then the yeshiva boys reserve the absolute right to protest and fight and do whatever within their means to make certain that such changes are implemented. In such case, and only such case, would I fight and protest alongside them. 3. The IDF doesn't even need these yeshiva boys, and they're more of a liability than anything else, and only because the IDF is so anti-Orthodox or religious is it messing with and disturbing the status quo. Rebuttal. This argument is hooey because of the following. First, while I agree that the secular left-led IDF may be mostly anti-Haredi and anti-Torah, this alone still does not make this argument a sound one. Instituting the draft mandate is merely that. If in fact it is thereafter determined that the IDF is well stocked and that there's no need for any more soldiers, it obviously won't just draft for the fun of it. Besides, there's no doubt that even the IDF is aware that the Haredi soldier is the most undesirable anyhow, for a host of reasons, and so these candidates, if at all, will be the last to be called up. Second, While it may be true that there's no need for these yeshiva boys to serve, it is so only because currently things are so lopsided and 90% of the IDF is made up of secular Israelis because of how the system was rigged for the past 80 years. If, however, the IDF implemented an equitable system, then of course the Haredim would be indispensable. I find this argument to be the height of circular reasoning. And with all due respect to many great rabbis who support the current status quo and harshly oppose any sort of abrogation, which, as stated above, isn't really a law per se, I call crocodile tears simply disingenuous. It would appear to me to be a case of arov psha'im tchaseh ahava, self-love or bias blurring, contorting, and masking many sins. And to bolster my position, please see Rabbi Yair Paran's 5-minute YouTube response to his cousin, Chief Sephardic Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, on this very issue. All that said, there is, however, one, not justification per se, but rather my own concocted basis for rebellion as follows. I despise Israel's government and always have. It stands for nothing and never did. See Part 1, or better yet, hear the following. A recently fallen Haredi hero, Israel Yutkin, was laid to rest on Jerusalem's Mount Herzl, the equivalent of our Arlington National Cemetery. However, when it came time for the government to engrave the headstone with the epitaph, it rejected the mother's tearful plea to add the standard gravestone terminology for one who dies sanctifying God's name, Hashem Yinkom Damo. May God avenge his blood. When my wife last week shared with me this horrific story, as well as the mother's tearful plea on national TV, I said to my wife, Israel will bend. Though not because it wants to, but because it is forced to for two reasons. First, it cannot withstand the pressure of a mother's threat, which it knew was genuine, to exhume her son's body from Mount Herzl and reinterm it either on Mount of Olives or Mount of Repose. Second, because it knows that it must remove as much reasonable indignation and justification of the Haredi anti-draft community. After all, this basis is the first, in my opinion, that fully justifies the Haredi draft dodging. As I stated above, while I'm not entirely sure of the kosher or modesty objections, I absolutely am of this. A so-called Jewish state denies a basic and consequential right to the deceased. Moreover, a fallen hero who gave his life so that all the Schmendricks losers in Knesset can continue to sit on their laurels in safety and freedom, and you're going to trample on his grave? Boy, if this weren't a public YouTube podcast, I would let you know how I really feel about this government in no uncertain terms. Only in Fakakta Israel would you find such unbridled chutzpah. And even as now, when the so-called right is in power, it is still a truly Fakakta Medina, and its government is made up of toxic and virulently sacrilegious, blasphemous, faithless, and theomachist individuals. I say go right ahead and resist. This government, or any predecessor thereof, never had a plan for and never cared to treat Israel as God's land. For if it did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So practically speaking, in the end, I couldn't care less. Epilogue. News broke yesterday, July 3rd, 2024, that Israel bent. Because my wife's Israeli, she naturally loves her country and on many occasions expresses her pining to return to settle there, mindful of its shortcomings. She does, however, constantly voice her single greatest pleasure of residing in the United States. That is, that our children, our boys, needn't serve in the army here and need not deal with the consequences or backlash associated thereto, unlike the case had we resided in Israel. Now, of course, it's natural for a mother more than a father to feel this way, and that's perfectly fine. But my response to her after sharing same has been, my dear, under the current government, I fully agree. If, however, my master, teacher, and guide, the saintly Reb Meir Kahana of blessed memory, were prime minister, I would hope that I raised our 3 sons in such a way that they would lie about their age at 17 and would skip the line with great alacrity to enlist, and I'd be the proudest dad in the world. As an aside, I'm convinced, as sure as I'm human, that had Kahana served as prime minister, not only would October 7th not have happened, neither would 9/11 have. In any event, the Haredim are up in arms about a Supreme Court decision that is for the most part merely academic and trivial. It is only symbolic in nature and nothing else. For as I began this part 3, Israel's Supreme Court wields zero power in this morass. Only the Ministry of Defense, if any body of government at all, possesses such broad powers. Furthermore, sadly, I absolutely take the Haredi threat at face value. That is, that most will choose death or imprisonment over enlisting if push should come to shove. Thus making all this threatening talk from the IDF or any other governmental body or individual academic and meaningless as well. It simply cannot imprison 70,000 men, and it certainly wouldn't meet capital punishment for a deserter or draft dodger, for these infractions are obviously not deserving of same. In conclusion, no justification exists for any exemption to serve in the IDF, save for a cripple, an ill man, or perhaps a single child. It is preposterous to think that even a secular leftist Israeli's blood, and by now you know with what disdain I hold him, is cheaper than yours. Why, the only caste system in Judaism of which I'm aware is Kohen Levi Yisrael, not ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservadox, etc., especially when we're talking about the very survival of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, an indisputable Milchemet Mitzvah.